might get too much involved in your token. You drift away and
and I don't have any. I saw that I can expand my just based on how much I can.
I don't know. The way it's cooler, still have some time. It's 10:45, 49 actually. Yeah, it looks like there is a connectivity. There are some connectivity. There is some connectivity here. It's not a lot of problems. They still have some problems. I don't know.
I think it's just too many people.
No.
Et puis vous le laissez amener tout le temps.
Tiens, 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 hey, hey, test, 1, 1.
Simultaneous wireless connections, then that would be fine.
How many people are there?
570 is the top level. 600 should be enough, because not everybody is connected. But it looks like it is not. What shall I say?
I mean, HTTP sucks.
Yeah, all the protocol sucks.
They all do.
Yeah, I have a perfect answer for what is beyond connectivity. Desert. As our keynote says, desert. So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think we could start with our session. The session on the SAML. As you know, SAML stands for Security Assertion Markup Language. And it proved nowadays, at least to some of us, that it is a lingua franca of federations nowadays. Although our keynote speaker this morning showed us that there is a protocol jungle over there. But just for the sake of this session, we will pretend SAML is the solution. And there is the several talks that will show you that SAML is widely used in practice. And I'd like now to announce our first speaker, Nate Klingenstein from the Internet 2, also one of the Shibboleth designers, architects, and the guys who put it out, and he has nice announcements to say, so Shibboleth 2 is here.
Hello there, everyone. I got a pretty good introduction already, so I'm not going to bore you anymore with my personal details. But I will bore you with some introductory material, because I'm not sure what composition of skill sets we have in this room, or who is familiar with the concept of federated identity. It may simply have been something you've heard about. And even for those of us who are well experienced with federated identity, I think it's good to go back to the first principles so we always remember what the important axioms are so we can work forward from them to the right conclusions. Identity systems on their own are inherently uninteresting. They don't do much. They sit there, they manage to broker identities and users, but if there are no users and if there are no applications, the identity system itself can just exist in a limbo. This is why we need to focus on getting users and applications connected to the identity systems and building the identity systems those users and applications need most. There are other small considerations, jokingly small, that go into building an identity management system, such as security, spam, privacy, secrecy, trust, authority, collaboration, and convenience. They're not small topics, but they pale in comparison to the importance of getting applications connected to users. Originally, applications connected to users simply by storing their own users in a database. This database would contain all the login and all the attribute information that every application needed. But we realized there was a lot of redundancy in that, so we started to build enterprise directories and databases. These enterprise directories and databases contained the common information that many of these applications shared. There may be pieces of information about me, such as my name, such as my birth date, such as my email address, that we don't want to have to maintain in all these places. If we keep it centrally, we've got fresh data, and that allows for better access control and better management of identities. That worked out fairly well. We moved some of the person handling out of the application, and from there we moved on to trying to build single sign-on systems. Because even with these directories, the application itself would often see the username, password, or the credentials the user had, or it would be responsible for processing those credentials. Because of that, applications had to do more work, and they could do it inconsistently, and users' login information was less well protected. So we built single sign-on systems where the application could request that the user be authenticated. After that, we realized this works great for the applications on campus. Now, what if we wanted to extend this to the applications that come from other domains? And that is the simple, small next step that led to the development of federated identity. SAML is a major federated identity standard. It allows you to send information about your users to applications and allows those applications to trust what comes back. This gives the applications authoritative information about individuals. If you pass trusted attributes from the identity provider that is entitled to say, for example, this is a member at Edinburgh University, then the application can make a better decision. It's got better knowledge. It has trusted knowledge. You could also maintain class lists, who's a staff member, contractual obligations, a lot of very interesting things that are core to the university's business, but information which is used to access services abroad frequently. The security on that is better than some of the alternatives, which is, we all know, setting up an IP address proxy, or just giving one big username and password to everyone, or operating one giant single point of failure in a portal. Another hidden benefit that federated identity introduces is the ability to have privacy. We don't have to send all the information we have to the application in every instance. And finally, federated identity is associated with a great number of externalities. In this case, they're generally positive externalities because if I set up a good identity system, a lot of people will save a lot of time and a lot of money managing identity information they would otherwise have had to keep locally. This is not always obvious, though. The beneficiaries in federated identity and in single sign-on are usually the application owners. But the people who do the work are the identity providers. We also think about the value of owning an identity. A lot of people out there think that having someone's identity is very valuable, but maybe not as valuable as it is expensive to make sure it's a good identity. So we end up with some interesting balances of power in the natural economics of federated identity, which have strong impacts on the way its deployments end up looking. I come from the Shibboleth project primarily. We started back in 2000 working on the concept of federated identity, and back then it was pretty ugly. Today it's marginally less ugly, which I consider big progress. We released our first code in 2003, and it's all released under a slightly modified Apache 2 based license, which means it's entirely free to take, bundle, wrangle, and sell, support, do whatever you please. The most important thing, I think, about the Shibboleth software and the Shibboleth project is we've focused on large deployments from the very beginning. We've focused on the enterprise. We all deal with enterprises here, large universities, where you have an organization that is trying to manage all of its users and all of its resources in a coherent fashion. And it needs to be able to apply the right policies for these groups of users and for these groups of resources. That focus has been unique in Shibboleth. Most other SAML products and most other open source alternatives have not focused as much on that piece of the puzzle. And especially in light of the presentation that Giles gave yesterday, I think that that's a very key point where Shibboleth is very strong. There's also excellent community support available, especially at Shibboleth users. Odds are, if you send a message to that list, we will respond within 15 or 30 minutes because there's a bunch of developers who have no lives. I'm kind of one of them. I'm going to skip over the demos since we've probably seen enough of this in action and I've seen enough failed demos that I'm not going to fall on that sword right now. But one quick graphical representation of this, just for people who are new to it. And, in fact, this is a little bit different from how Shibboleth 1.3 worked. This is the default protocol flow for Shibboleth 2.0. First, the user says, I'd like access. The service provider then works with the user to determine where their home is. And that can be done in a lot of different ways, and that's probably actually the single most contentious part of federated identity. After the user has said, this is my home, the user is then sent back with a trusted message to log in at home. It passes through the browser and through the ugly little user box in my picture. And the message is presented to the identity provider. The user then logs into the identity provider through whatever means are necessary. You could present all kinds of information here. You could present a username and password. You could present a Kerberos ticket. You could use an LDAP directory. You could use a username and password from a database. Or more interestingly, you could use other federated identity too, such as your OpenID and your info card or another SAML token from another IDP. It becomes very easy to chain these together, and that will be very powerful later. Once I've logged in successfully, I send my data from the identity provider to the service provider in what's known as a SAML assertion. The service provider then makes an access control decision based on those attributes and maybe some other attributes it stores locally and chooses to return the page. The big difference between this and Shibboleth 1.3 can be explained in a simple joke. We used to be able to say, knock knock, who's there? And then we would say, big random string. And then you're supposed to say, big random string who? And then we would say, ndk at internet2.edu, staff, student. Oh, that's who. And now you're in. That's how the flows used to work. Now in Shibboleth 2.0, it's knock knock. Oh, thank you. You guys are lazy this morning. Knock knock, who's there? And then I would just say, ndk at internet2 staff student right away. So the joke is dead. And I think it's a good thing when your project is no longer represented by a knock-knock joke. 2.0, I've been coming here promising the release of 2.0 so many times. I still have mistakes on my slides. 2.0 is released. It's actually available today. It was released in March of 2008. And we've actually got quite a few sites that are using it in production now. There are some significant bugs still to be ironed out, and there's a lot of functionality we still want to add. But I view Shibboleth 2.0 as a very strong improvement over 1.3. We are also taking feature requests at the present, if you have any in particular, that you would like to see in the next releases of Shibboleth 2. But I suggest you familiarize yourself with the code base and focus your suggestions on actual use cases, specific problems you would like to be able to solve. Very importantly, Shibboleth 2.0, sure, he knows I like to walk. Very importantly, Shibboleth 2.0 is fully backward compatible with Shibboleth 1.3. Fully here is a bit of a nuanced qualified term, but it is sufficiently fully for all default installations and most use cases that I feel comfortable putting it on a slide. It's also obviously able to speak SAML 2.0, the major version that everyone else has implemented. So at this point, interop between commercial SAML products and Shibboleth is much simpler than it was in the past. The default profile now no longer has the back channel communications, hence the dead knock-knock joke. Instead, we have all the information pushed through the browser in an encrypted form. That allows you to not worry about the firewall issues that have plagued so many deployers. No more need to open port 8443 unless you want to use some advanced functionality or be backward compatible in a specific way. The installation process has seen a great deal of work. We actually generate certificates for you during installation so that you don't have to worry about that. We hope that will take some of the load off of Federation administrators and off of installers of the software. These are special certificates, and special only in the sense that we made them, that can be used to connect IDPs to SPs. You could use any old certificate there, of course, but we just put in one that is automatically generated for you. So by default, it's pretty simple. The configuration files have also seen a lot of work, in particular on the IDP side, and we are working very hard on additional packaging. If you have a CentOS S or Red Hat 4 or 5 box, installation of Shibboleth at this point is rpm star.rpm. So we think that we've got the installation process there pretty well down, but we continue to work on packaging for other less simple systems. There's a Mac ports distribution available for people who prefer Macintoshes, and on Solaris, you're Solaris is Solaris. We're doing our best. For Windows, there is a handy installer, and you'll hear a little bit more later today about a specialized Windows installer we've worked on to try to make it easier to integrate with Active Directory. The metadata has been improved dramatically. We are trying our best to move away from static trust lists towards something more dynamic. There are still a lot of hidden benefits from these static trust lists. You get advertisement of services, you get mutual communities, you get trust, you get awareness. But we need to move to a more distributed model because having individual specific trust lists for every country leads to some really painful scaling issues. And it kind of limits us to working best in higher ed, where we would like to interoperate seamlessly with pretty much anyone. The metadata itself can now be automatically downloaded simply by pointing at a URL. You could actually point at the URL of a metadata generator of another provider, and everything else will happen automatically. What this means is in your IDP, you'd put the SP's metadata location. Automatically, your IDP would know everything about that SP. The configuration doesn't look all that much simpler. In particular, the IDP config has been scattered out to 6 individual files, and shibboleth 2.xml is quite a bit longer than shibboleth 1.xml was. However, the amount of stuff that you need to change within those files and the way you need to change them is dramatically simpler. There's 1 or 2 configuration changes needed on the IDP side to get up and running with a federation, and there are probably 3 or 4 required on the SP side. We think that's a good improvement, and even better, some changes in how the SP loads configuration files have made it possible to actually distribute configuration files for service providers within an entire community or federation. So if you know what someone's config is going to look like, but you don't know their environment, you don't know their OS, you don't know their paths, doesn't matter. At this point, the configurator is smart enough at guessing all that information that you can distribute these configuration files easily. An interesting feature that we added is that attribute configuration can be distributed as well. Attributes are little pieces of information about people that we send around, and there's a set of default standard attributes that are widely used. You can always define your own attributes too. You might also define which attributes go to which groups of people. It's possible to write templates or to write rules that can be distributed by a central body and sucked in by the providers at the other ends, so you can actually have some form of consistent rule templating for an entire community. This effectively means a federation could say, these 20 SPs have been specially checked, and we've set up this little rule. If you want to send anything special to these particular 20 SPs, just reference this rule. Makes that configuration a lot simpler, and it makes it a lot more dynamic. The 2.0 IDP has been completely rewritten. The architecture itself is ridiculous. It is ridiculously open. We went through a tremendous number of refactorings just trying to get the code just right. And of course, code is never just right. But we think we've done a pretty good job because at this point, you could pull SAML out of it entirely and it would be just fine. You could set up a shibboleth IDP that spoke only the OpenID protocol. You could set one up that only spoke ADFS. You can plug in an arbitrary number of protocols, and it has all the design and all the configuration necessary to allow you to support those protocols all at once. My hope is that this will give enterprises that need to manage the privacy and the attributes of their users a single point of configuration for any protocol an application would like to speak, any user that would like to visit those applications. That's still a little ways off because we don't have support for every protocol I would like to see, but we have full support for SAML 2.0, and we have full backward compatibility with shibboleth 1.3. Spring is used for the configuration, so you can write plugins, add them to the Spring dependencies, and it will get sucked in at runtime. It's relatively simple to extend the IDP. It's a Java-based servlet still. We've bumped the version requirement from 1.4 to 1.5. We don't find that particularly onerous at the present, so it has also been fully tested with 1.6 and 1.7, or 6 and 7, depending on your nomenclature. Apache Velocity is embedded in most of the attribute and attribute filtering files, so you can write rules for the filtering of attribute information in basically any language you want except Perl. Literally, it's except Perl. I don't understand why. It's also very easy to set up the IDP only in Tomcat, so you no longer need necessarily to front it with Apache, which may make configuration easier in some cases. If you would like to still front-end it with Apache, it's perfectly doable. We've added built-in support for authentication for many common forms of authentication. There's LDAP, Kerberos, and IP address authentication already built in. And for all the methods that are not built into that, there's still remote user. So if you have anything that can authenticate the user external to Shibboleth, it is still easy to pull that authentication in and have Shibboleth rely on the resulting username. The attribute resolution engine is now extremely clever. It can do things that I don't understand, but it can also do things that I do understand. It's flexible. There's a lot of options in the configuration that make it easy to define basic attributes when you need to, and easy to create complicated scripted attributes if you ever feel like it. And I haven't yet. For most deployments, you won't need to really touch that because the defaults in there will address most of your needs. And again, operators of federations can help with that. Configuration for the IDP is now based on anonymous requests, default requests, and specific requests. This means you can set up an IDP that is as promiscuous or as Puritan as you please. Especially if you took heavy use of the anonymous element, you would release whatever information you would like to anyone. That may sound like bad data stewardship. It probably is, but it might actually address a use case that you have. You can also choose to never respond to any unauthenticated querier. Yeah. The security policies themselves, which determine how and what to trust, are also fully configurable, but I hope most people will never try to touch those. The 2.0 SP has been extensively redesigned internally so that it is no longer hard-coded to SAML either. The SP can also speak an arbitrary number of protocols and is not dependent on any one of them. We've done a lot of work to revamp the configuration files. I mentioned the ability to split to distribute Shibboleth files that contain the configuration information for the service provider. AAP.xml, which used to be the file that determined which attributes came in, which policies were applied, and which headers they were mapped to, has now been split. So there is one attribute map file that says, I get this attribute name from the protocol. It turns into this name for the application. And then there's a separate filter policy, and that can be configured to apply any rules that you deem necessary. The assertion export mechanism no longer uses an HTTP header just because they get too big, and Apache tends to break with extraordinarily large headers. So instead, we've invented a new protocol called HTTP GET. And with this brand new protocol, you access a specific URL and you get the assertion back. That's for applications that actually want to deal with the raw XML. There's built-in clustering using databases. There's also an implementation, I believe, from our friends in Portugal that allows memcache to be used for session replication as well. We don't view this as necessarily all that important because applications often take care of their own sessions. If you have a load balancer that has some degree of stickiness in front of the applications, then you usually have enough stickiness to complete single login, at which point the application can manage sessions however the application does its thing. If the application wants to rely on Shibboleth and its clustering of sessions, though, it can now do so. We also use environment variables by default instead of headers because headers can be spoofed. We have extensive provisions in the code to try to prevent header spoofing, but we can't guarantee that's secure, and environment variables are generally better protected in Apache. The session initiation support has also been greatly expanded, but that's too messy to go into for now. Attribute filter policies are the generalization of our old ARPs and our old AAPs. It's the exact same concept with a little bit more vocabulary and a slightly different vocabulary. There's really nothing particularly new there, though, except that we're using the same language on both sides. Switch has, and also, as I learned here, WAIF, the Danes, have built a clever policy viewer or an assent viewer that allows you to delegate the question of what information should be released to a consent-based decision for the user. I think that this is absolutely key to scaling because we shouldn't have to require users to call up the help desk and say, I want to release attributes 4, 5, and 6 to the service provider Z every time they want access. We need to put more of that decision into the user's hands when it's appropriate to do so, still bearing in mind our responsibilities as stewards of their data. So what comes next? I think logout support in the IDP is an important goal. We have logout support in the SP, and we have limited support for logout in the IDP. We just don't have global logout yet, where you send a logout request from the SP to the IDP, which blows away the sessions at both. That part works. The logout from there, where the IDP tells all the other SPs in the world this user may have visited, doesn't work yet. And that's a very hard problem to do because it's so distributed across so many domains that work so differently. We also want to look at name ID management so that it's possible to get rid of stale accounts. When we provision accounts for applications quite frequently these days, there is a database, usually, that retains some information about the user. It doesn't usually make sense to try to store everything about the user in the centralized enterprise directory, so some specific privileges and permissions and application-specific stuff, like your wiki editing preferences, will never be in this backend directory. They live with the application. So this protocol allows the IDP and the SP to notify the application that they would like to get rid of that account. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to get there, but it's pretty critical for the security of federated identity. There's also a lot of work to be done to set up better documentation. I know we've gotten a lot of comments about that. We've done our very best to make 2.0's documentation as good as possible, and it's a wiki, so we encourage everyone here, if they have insights, to go scrawl all over it and try to help us make it better. We've persistently looked at writing a Java SP to go along with our module-based SP. We haven't heard many very strong use cases for this yet, but I think that they are out there. And if you have particular needs for Java SP where you just can't run Apache, let us know, and we'll try to bump that up on the prioritization list. We also want to put an attribute resolver in the SP that allows us to grab information from multiple sources so that someday in the future, we'll be able to support a scenario like the following. I believe there is a strong likelihood that at some point, most of the identifiers people have will not be from the primary institutions. We won't issue most of our identifiers. I think that we will rely on identifiers and basic identity information that is at third parties, maybe commercial providers, maybe the government, maybe other third parties, but someone else will do the basic account maintenance and ownership, and our job, which it always will be and has been, is to attach the right attributes like this is a student, this person has been licensed under contract XYZ, or this student is in these classes, and then pass that information along to the service as a collection. The ability to do that will depend on some of the implementation work here, but I think personally that's a critical use case to support because we are finally seeing good uptake of federated identity in the commercial world, which I find tremendously exciting. We need to do what we can to integrate with that and anticipate the future world it might make possible. That's my introduction to Shibboleth 2.0 today, and I really appreciate you being such a great audience. Happy to entertain any questions you may have.
Thank you, Nate. Because it was so short, we have a time for only one question.
And that's for a short presentation.
Yeah. Any questions? Or you can ask.
No problem.
There is one. Tomasz.
We're interested, I'd like to ask about the Java SP. It depends on which libraries.
Mm-hmm. Which libraries would it depend on?
Yeah, of course, if you are going to use the Java SP, you are going to use it in conjunction with some other, with the real application, right? And the application will be using some libraries itself, right? So
right. There would have to be an API of some sort for the application.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So we are afraid. Is there the danger that there might be any library version mismatch or all those sorts of problems? And
there are some good arguments in favor of setting up a Java SP that's native, in that you don't need to set up an Apache front end. But there are a lot of bad reasons to use a native Java as well, because you can end up having to link all kinds of things into your Java web app. And in particular, that can really tick off some commercial providers, because they will invalidate your support, saying, you modified our application, we can't be responsible now for anything horrible that happens to it. I don't think that there are any direct library mismatches that are likely. You might run into some with the XML validation, but I don't see huge problems there. Where I do see huge problems is service providers not honoring their contracts once you add SSO. We have had specific examples of that from specific vendors, and I'm not here to name names.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nate, again.
Thanks, guys.
Our next speaker is Louis Searchwell from Janet, and he will continue on Shibboleth, but I think with a little bit less advanced version. It's 1.3, I think, but with an interesting case of trying to make easy installation of Shibboleth a little bit easier on Windows platforms. So,
yeah, thank you. Morning, everybody. My name is Louis Searchwell. I work for Janet UK, and as was just introduced, we are trying to make Shibboleth work much, much easier with in a Microsoft environment and using Active Directory. So the contents of my talk really is going to be more informal. It's going to sort of give an explanation of trials that we're actually running. The trials are running on an installer wizard for installation of Shibboleth into a Microsoft environment using Active Directory. I'm going to tell you about why we're actually doing it, because there is quite a demand for this service. How it works. What I'm going to do is run through a few of the pages of the installer to actually give you an indication of how it actually works. And I'm going to talk about the objectives that we have for this project. Janet usually goes through a system of where they actually run trials, and the idea is to get some of the institutions to actually test, to actually test what we're developing and give some feedback. And I'll give you sort of an idea of how far we've got. Tell you about the conclusions, which is quite interesting. And if anybody is actually interested in the installer, I'll give you some information at the very end of where you can actually. Well, it is not actually available to everybody at the moment, but documentation is there on the Internet 2 site, so you can actually go and look at it. And I think very shortly it will be available to everybody. So, well, the UK Federation was launched in November 2006, and it actually feeds almost 12 to 18 million users in the Janet community. So it's quite a huge community, and it's funded by JISC and Bector, and there's a huge push from the government to actually for federated access for simple reason. I think mainly it's to do with cost savings, shared environments. The estimate of organizations, I mean, this is an interesting one because when we first started out looking at developing the installer wizard, we imagined that there were 30% of the institutions within the UK were Shibboleth users, and as it turned out, it started to move closer to 70%. So 70% with Microsoft environments and looking at Active Directory backend. So why? I mean, I've just gone into some of the reasons as to why we actually need this installer wizard. I think one of the main reasons, I believe one of the main reasons, is to reduce the barriers for the smaller institutions. We have, Janet itself, we have an audience of further education, higher education, and schools, and the resources for some of these institutions, it varies across. So the smaller institutions really need, this type of thing to actually help them join the federation and become, Shibboleth compliant. Reduce the complexity. I think this is another reason why we looked at the wizard. Shibboleth is quite complex for some people to actually install, particularly, as I've said, a school, as, maybe one technician. They've probably got a Microsoft environment. They really don't have the resources to actually, do a Linux install or sort of install Shibboleth in Tomcat, install all the rest of, the resources that are needed to run a Shibboleth environment. So, yeah, I think that's a valuable reason. What we've actually done with the installer is simplify the steps. So there is only four settings you need to do to actually install Shibboleth, which I think for the developer that's quite an accomplishment. I'll show you how it works. So what does it do? Well, I've just mentioned it prompts a minimum amount of installation information for the install. Java, Tomcat, and Shibboleth are automatically installed, automatically configured to a certain level. There are actually two things you need to, two settings you need to make on the actual on the Tomcat install. It creates the installation notes, and it creates the next notes, which is quite helpful, for these sort of technical people in the smaller institutions, because it is actually telling you how to do the install. It takes you all the way through the install. So it really simplifies it in a big way. And what you don't have to do is it's just simply just the opposite of what I've just mentioned previously. Download and configure a shopping list, because it automatically does that for you. You don't have to change the Active Directory LDAP schema, which is, I think that's a great plus for the smaller institutions. And the rest of I've mentioned previously, so I won't go into that. This is an example of the initial page of the wizard. So when you run the wizard, this is the first page you come to. You click next, and then these are the parameters that you need to change. Well, just the second and third parameters, the Active Directory domain IDP is actually the IDP that the user's logged into. So when you run this, it actually configures the domain that you're in. The DNS you need to change, and the scope you need to add. The rest it does for you. So, and this is a typical sort of Microsoft wizard page, you can use the typical or use the complete. The recommended is the typical. We've actually added the custom one because there was a feature request for where the actual install went. Some people wanted to install it in a specific area on the disk, and so we added this third one. That's come from the feedback from the trials. These are the second two settings that you need to change. One is the Tomcat firewall. You can change the ports. The ports there is a default port, 8442 and 8443, but you can change them. The UK Federation metadata, well, obviously the Federation metadata for the UK, if you're installing it for a different federation, you would obviously need to change that. As I said, these are the only two settings you need to change. So 4 settings, these two, and then the scope and the DNS. And that's it completed. So, that's how easy it is to actually install this. Well, I say easy, but then you have to go through the test. And these are the test notes. So it comes, congratulations, next steps, and actually takes you through what you need to do next and what you don't actually need to do. And then once you've got to this stage, you need to test it. And there is a site, TestShip site, which you can enter the entity and go through the test. And once you've got through this test, then there is a next stage where you actually join the federation. But once you've got through this test, you know that Shibboleth is actually working. And in the trials, when we actually run the trials, we didn't actually get much feedback, and I couldn't figure out why. I was thinking to myself, why are we not getting any feedback from this? And then as it turned out, that the installer actually worked. It worked without any problems at all. So we got, the developer did a magnificent job on the install, I must admit that. I think there was one error, which was something to do with someone had the wrong port setting or something like that. So there were no errors, and the installer did a magnificent job. Once you've gone through the test ship, that means the installer actually works. So the next stage is to test it with the federation, of course. So you're either, if you're not a member of a federation, you need to join a federation, and then you need to configure access to Active Directory. And that's if it's not in the same location. If it's not co-located, then you really need to sort of tell the installer where not the installer. You need to tell the SHIB where it actually is. You need a certificate to protect the ports. Obviously, from when you go out into the internet, 8442, 843, you need to protect those ports. And Janet itself, they provide the certificates for port protection. You need to punch 2 holes in your firewall as well. This is so you can get access to the LDAP and Kerberos ports. And I'll give you a demonstration how that works in a minute. As I've said, 8442 and 8443 has to be visible. And in this example, the Shibboleth IDP is located in the DM zone. So as you can see there's 2 firewalls on either side. The firewall going out to the SPN user is the Tomcat firewall. So the settings in the Tomcat on that page that I signified earlier is these 2 settings. Yeah. So if you want to change the ports, then you would change to a number of ports of your preference. I think that the Kerberos and LDAP ports are fixed, so I'm not sure if they are changeable. So our objectives for this particular project, what we did was we established a number of sites as a test bed, and we had 6 sites, and we were looking at further education because there was a preference. That's where the demand is for this type of thing. Our education institutions generally have the resources to actually install a fully fledged Shibboleth. Further educations, they seem to struggle with this for some reason, but so we were looking at actually having more further education institutions. And what we wanted them to do was just test the the Shibboleth installation wizard and provides us with some feedback, which, as I mentioned before, there wasn't much feedback, and the reason for that was that the development did a really good job. So what we need to do is we need some documentation for the wizard, because I'm quite sure the wizard will be available. There are timescales at the end, but I think it will be available very soon. So we really need the documentation for it. And on these trials, I suppose we've got to push for some documentation. There is some documentation available on Internet 2 sites, which gives you an indication of how the installer actually works, the parameters for changing. These are the sites involved in the trials. As I mentioned, there's four colleges, one university, and C2K, which is it's an organisation in Northern Ireland that actually it runs. It's almost like an NREN, and it actually runs. It will be running the IDP for 320,000 end users. So we can test there the scalability of Shibboleth. Well, it'll be an interesting, case study, that's for sure. And most of these case studies we'll actually put on the Janet site. Wider participation. When we didn't actually get any feedback, we thought it might be a good idea to actually try and get other people involved in the test, but not on a contractual basis, to see if that was the issue. But as I mentioned again before, and I mentioned again, there was no issues with the installer. Right, timescales for the project. I'm going to say we expect it to be completed by August 2008, and what I mean by completed is that the documentation and everything else with it, but the beta version of it is actually almost ready to be released. I don't know if any of you are interested in it, but I'll give you the details at the end. But yeah, the beta version is almost ready to be released, and the developer tells me that it will only be available on a beta version, but they're looking at development of the SHIB2 version, on which I believe he started already, and they expect a release of the SHIB2 version in autumn. So the conclusions. Well, I think it's met. I mean, the actual software has met what the requirements for sure, because the install does require very few parameters. 4 settings needs to be changed. It is ideal for organisations with limited resources, but there is a trade-off there. It does work. We know it works. As I said, we tested it. The 1.3 beta 1 version will be available in the near future. I cannot say it will be available. It is available now, because I'm not sure what the stage it is with the developer, but it's gone out to certain lists. It's gone out, for example, to this mailing list there, the Shib and Windows mailing list. So if anybody's interested in installing, they need to join that mailing list, and or perhaps contact me, send me an email, and I'll give you a copy of I'll send you a copy, or I'll tell you where you can actually get it. We do have a project website, which is on the Janet website, so if you want to actually more information on the installer, then you can go to that website. And as I've mentioned before, the documentation is up on the Internet 2 site, so if you want to read about the present state of the installer, then you can go to the Internet 2 site. And that's it for me. Any questions?
So, thank you, Luis. And we have time for more than one question. So,
quick question. How do you deal with attribute mapping, expressing, for example, inverse scope affiliation? And as well, do you handle TID?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last bit, but the bit about scope affiliation, how do you deal with it? Do
do you have a default mapping in AD?
there is a setting. Can I?
Yes, you may.
Yeah. Is it going back? No. What's happening? Oh, no. There is a setting that you can change for the scope. So you just add whichever scope you know.
And I don't mean how do you set the scope, but how do you determine, for example, that this person in AD should return a scope affiliation of staff and students?
Oh, right. What I failed to say is that there are some files that you can configure. For example, the ARP file, which you can set your attributes, and set the attributes to your specific organization.
And the second question was, have you been able to support for in-person targeted ID?
Yeah, it is enabled. It's a default. Yeah. Any more?
My name is Wim Pennings from the Delft University of Technology. You mentioned it's well suitable for universities with limited resources. Would you also advise it for universities with large resources?
Well, yeah, any university can use it. It's just an installer shibboleth. Just a normal installer shibboleth. Really, all it does is actually does the Tomcats, and the rest of it for you. I mean, those files are changeable. You can configure them in any way you want. It's not, fixed. But when the wizard installs it in such a way that it sets those parameters for you. So it just makes it easier for smaller organizations to actually do the install. So there are actually big institutions that are looking at, installing it. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
There are no disadvantages using the directory combination rather than the Unix version.
I'm not sure about that. I don't think I'm sort of got the technical knowledge to answer that question. You may be able to answer it. No. The question was, are there any disadvantages to using this in an Active Directory than in the Unix version? I don't think.
I don't see any specific disadvantages from my point of view.
Yeah.
No, I think this is great work, and I'm really thrilled that they've done such an excellent job on it.
Yeah, I think it's quite impressive, actually. And in the short space of time that it's been done, we started this project in I think it's January, starting at the beginning of February, and almost the beta version is here now.
So make a suggestion. What you should do for like next version is to add support for NTLM authentication in the web front end, because that's really going to make it a killer application for an AD deployment. In that case, the users will never see a password dialog anywhere.
Was that a question? I can't really hear it.
It's not a question. It's a suggestion that you try to include in a future version support for NTLM authentication as the default authentication, rather than dialog-based password authentication backed on Kerberos. Because what Windows users are used to in a sort of pure Windows environment with AD is that you never see a password dialog. Everything is just done based on the initial workstation logon, right? And the way you translate that onto a web application is to use NTLM authentication or negotiate authentication, which is readily available as implementations in Java too, right? So you add that as one of the supported authentication mechanisms in SHIB, and you got a really good deal for a Windows environment.
Well, can I just suggest that if you join the mailing list, and you put forward suggestions, I'm sure the developers would be, or the developer would be, quite grateful for any sort of information that you have, or features that you would like to see, or changes you would like to see with it.
Okay, so thank you, Luis, again. Let me now announce our last speaker for today, who will show us that you can do SAML without Shibboleth at all. Andreas Solberg comes from Uninet, and he will give us a talk on simple SAML PHP tool. Andreas.
Thanks, Miro. Yes, as you said, my name is Andreas Solberg, and I'm from Uninet, from Norway. And ironically, I'm working with identity management and wearing my password around my neck. I'm going to talk about a software tool that's named Simple SAML PHP that we have been developing in Jam project and in Uninet. We have been working it, but we also have a lot of other people helping out a community. I'm also going to talk a little bit about an approach of making software the simple way. First, what is Simple SAML PHP? First, can every one of you that have heard about Simple SAML PHP raise your hand? Just to... great, thank you. But for those of you that have not heard about it, Simple SAML PHP is simple applications that implement SAML in the programming language PHP. The SAML part is because we wanted to make a SAML implementation, but during time we have implemented also some other protocols. What do I mean when I say simple? Because it could mean a lot of things. But I mean simple in a lot of different axes and dimensions. I mean we want a software that is simple to install. As we have heard in the previous presentation, there exists software that could be complex to install, and I think that maybe there are some commercial software that we have experience with. I will not mention any name, but that are far more complex that you could imagine. It should be simple to, if you have an application that you want to enable federated authenticated login, it should be simple to kind of hook it to a federated login. So that's one aspect. It should be simple to maintain an installation of the federation software, because I think that people working with identity management have a lot of things to do, and it should not spend their time of doing software updates on advanced configuration and so on. And maybe most important, I think it's important that the software we are doing is simple to develop. It should be simple for new developers to understand the code and participate and contribute. And the code base should be small, so it's easy to track, debug what is really going on. If you are in a position where you're trying to learn more about SAML 2, I think that's a good idea if you can go to the source code, read it, and then have an understanding of what it's all about. And installing Simple SAML PHP should be very simple. In most of the cases, it's just downloading a folder and dropping it in the Apache directory of a server, and it's up and running. It's installed. We have very few external dependencies, so it should work with most basic PHP installations. We require PHP 5, which of course could cause problems for someone. So that's a challenge to make sure you have installed the version 5 of PHP. Although it's several years as it was finally released, there are some package maintainers that not yet have upgraded to version 5. after you have installed it, of course, you have to configure metadata, and that should also be simple. What we have been working with the last couple of weeks is to make metadata configuration optional when you don't really have to. We have made a default way of setting the service provider entity ID to the URL of your metadata if you have not provided an entity ID, and also you can, yeah. So what can you use Simple SAML for? And I'll try to mention some use cases so you can better understand how to use it in practice. One is for as a service provider. You have an application, a PHP application, a wiki, a bug tracking system, e-learning platform as Moodle, for instance, and you want to enable federated login. Then you can install Simple SAML PHP within, together with the service. Of course, you have to do some modifications in the service itself. That could be really difficult, and it could be really simple. And that's kind of nothing we can fix. That's up to the implementers of the application itself, and it depends whether they have a good authentication module API or not. You can also use Simple SAML PHP on the IDP side. You can run an identity provider for a university, for a school, for a company. You can even run a centralized IDP for a lot of universities. You can connect service provider to that IDP. Some examples. In Denmark, they have made a complete federation built upon Simple SAML PHP. They are using it in a special architecture where you run proxy with SAML2 in the middle, connecting a lot of service provider to that centralized SAML2 Simple SAML installation, as well as having both LDAP interfaces and SAML2 interfaces towards identity providers or institutions. We have a lot of users in the US that want to set up federated login to Google Apps. Google Apps is supporting SAML 2.0, so that's one of the things that people use Simple SAML for. Another thing that you can do with Simple SAML is to set up a bridge, either because you want to simplify metadata distribution, so you have a single centralized identity provider, or because you want to bridge protocols that are not compatible. For instance, if you have a lot of Shibboleth 1.3 IDPs, you can set up a bridge and then connect SAML2 service providers to it. You can use it to connect the SAML2 service provider Google Apps to your Shibboleth 1.3 IDP. You can do some cool stuff with OpenID that we have been experimenting with. You can translate a protocol from the Spanish PAPI or the A-Select protocol from Netherlands to SAML2. And one of the main reasons why we started working on bridging protocols was in the Jant JR5 project, where we are working on inter-federation called EduGain. We also have some work in the Nordic country called the Kalmar Union, where we do inter-federation connections. So I said that Simple SAML can be used both as a service provider and an identity provider. And between those two entities, you can talk a lot of different protocols. We mainly use SAML2, and that's the kind of main focus on our work. But we also have implemented the Shibboleth 1.3 protocol here it's important to mention that this is, when we're talking about shibboleth, we are saying that we support the shibboleth protocol and not to distinguish that from the software itself. We also have the A-Select and PAPI, and we are working on OpenID and a lot of different protocols that we play with. And and then again about how to do application, the simple approach. I'm not saying that this is the correct way of doing software implementation. It's just one approach that we chose and seems to work. Abstraction layers is something where you you have a lot of features with it, where you can extend functionality. It enforces you can reuse code, but I think that a lot of people may overuse this approach, and a lot of software could be difficult to track and read when you see that the number of, when over 50% of the code is abstract classes and interfaces, then at least for myself, I think it's difficult to go through the code and see what's really going on. But of course, we need to have extensibility, and we need to make it possible to extend the software. So we have carefully chosen parts of the software where you can add new functionality. And one of those is adding new authentication module or plugin. We have currently done a lot of LDAP, which is the natural choice because most people have users stored in an LDAP repository. But we also have done a lot of work with CAS, contributions from Denmark. We have some other contributions with Postgres from Spain. And we have contributions from Luxembourg with Radius. We have self-register module and work on client certificates and PKI. We also needed to have a way of making session handlers where you can select different ways of storing your sessions. The main reason is that you should be able to run a load balance and failover on large-scale systems, and then the built-in PHP sessions, which is really easy to use and doesn't require you to set up an additional software. It will, of course, not work across different computers. So therefore, we wanted to have a new optional session handler using the memcache. As we have heard earlier, it's possible to do the same with the shibboleth software. Storing sessions allows you to remember the user when he returns, where you have a single sign-on. It caches information you need to perform single logout. And it caches your attributes. When we implemented Simple SAML PHP, we used the PHP programming language, and there's a lot of options to use fancy frameworks that does a lot of things for you. But of course, that's a good idea when you can write less code and make things happen automatically. But still, we don't use any of these frameworks. Why not? It's difficult because there are so many different frameworks out there, and many of them are really complex. If you use a specific framework, it's a problem to get more developers in your community to help you extend the code, because you would require them to understand and have selected the same framework. So it's already limiting down the potential developers when you have selected a programming language. That's impossible to avoid, I think, because you have to write it in some language. But then we chose to not further limit down the potential developer mass that could join our community. I'm going to talk a little bit about scalability, because some people may think and may claim, maybe it's a myth, but it's easy to think that a really simple system can, of course, not scale to a really large enterprise environment. I will claim the opposite, that it's actually not that difficult, because adding scalability to enterprise large system will be really complex if the software you maintain is not intended for scalability in the first place. And then if you want to add scalability or load balancing and failover, things get really hairy. So when you have a really simple approach, you have no shared session between each HTTP request, as you don't have in PHP. When you then want to add scalability and failover and load balancing, it's much easier than if you are dealing with a complex product. So simple SAML PHP can be scaling for really simple installations which don't require any additional software. It's just set up and run. This will not give you failover and load balancing, but we can scale to that also by using the memcache session handler. We can allow you to run any number of stupid front ends that don't have any memory. You can add a matrix of load balanced and failover servers running memcache. We have some code on top of memcache that will replicate the sessions to several memcache servers, which seem to work really smooth. And then some words about XML-based protocols, because there are several ways of dealing with that. What we have seen that is one approach that people use when they are are going to implement support for XML-based protocol is that they use some automatic tool to generate classes and objects from all the possible XML elements and attributes in the both from XSD or from XML schema. That will generate a lot of code, and it could be difficult to work with. Of course, it's done automatically, but still, there's a lot of code there that's running, and that you. And another approach is, of course, to do the same manually, that you manually create classes for every possible portion of the XML protocol. That's one way of doing it. And of course, we did it another way. We are pretty static about what we send in Simple SAML, because the requests are more or less similar from time to time. There's not very much different messages. So we basically use a template framework where we have the basic structure and then put in variables where we need to do them, add stuff. When we receive stuff, we use the XPath query protocol to retrieve just the things that we need. And we, instead of mapping all the protocol into objects and classes, we basically go through it. During the last year, Simple SAML has gained a lot of interest, and there are a lot of developers that are contributing, and also a lot of people that are using the software both in production system environments, also in Denmark they're building an entire federation upon Simple SAML, but also people are using it just to get to know SAML better, just setting up to play with, see how it works. and we have a lot of users in the US using it for Google Apps. It's translated to, I updated the slides because there was 2 new languages recently, so we have now 13 languages translation. Actually, the day before we went with the 1.0 release, we have only the English language and some Norwegian. And then I announced on the mailing list saying that, okay, if you want your language to be in the 1.0 release, then send me an email within a few hours. So then I spent all night copying and pasting different languages. And it was really fun, but because it showed that open source communities really work. We have, although the software is pretty new, it's not that many. I think we released the 1.0 release, stable release earlier this year, approximately in March, I think. We have almost 100 users that are participating on the mailing list. I think that's a good sign when we see that people are giving each other support of how to install the software, so that we that are developing it are not do not need to do all the user support ourselves. People are helping each other out. We have we have also some meetings, and we have had a few workshops with the Danish developers where we meet and basically implement stuff. That's an introduction to how we thought when you made the software and what the software can do. But if you want to know more about it, you can visit the homepage of the software, where you can find mailing list, wiki, official documentation, and also download the software. Or, of course, you can just send me an email or meet me during this conference. I would be happy if you have a laptop and the network is working at the moment. We can set it up to make it work, and then, yeah, I can demonstrate it. Yeah, I think that's how is it on the time. Yeah. Yeah, I can say that we have some other projects that we are working on in FIDE that's related to Simple SAML. We have recently set up what we called an open IDP, which is I think that there exist a lot of those already, but we set up one that's based on SAML2, where if you have a service provider and you want to test the software, I think it's similar to the test chip for Shibboleth 1.3. You can just register your metadata and go to the page and actually connect your service provider to this. But what's different from test chip is that this could also run as a production system, because you can connect your services there, you can register new users, and you can use this as a self-register identity provider. So when you have a service that you want to provide to the universities in your federations, and some of these users want, for instance, to give access to a wiki to some users outside the federation. How can you do that when the whole system is entirely closed into a federation? What we did was that we have an option for connecting SAML2 service provider to this open IDP and let user register themselves. No security at all, we just trust the person. But what we do is that we give out unique user ID to that person, so that that person can call the administrator of that specific wiki and say that I'm person number then, and you know me, give me access. And we also have some projects related to wiki farms, where you can sign, register, log in through a federated login and create new wikis, and via web interface set up new wikis with access control based on out of attributes from the Federation. And we also have a lot of other interesting projects that you can read more about on the blog. That's rnd.feide.no. So, any questions?
We have time for questions, so please don't be shy.
Yes?
Wait for a mic.
I assume this is interoperable with the Shibboleth implementations, but what about commercial vendors, Federation products? Can you exchange SAML assertions between simple SAML PHP and those products?
Can you? Yes. I didn't catch your whole question, but you asked about compatibility with commercial vendors. Yeah. Because we are using standardized protocols like SAML2, they will work with commercial vendors, yes. And we have been testing some of these commercial vendors. We have been doing interoperability tests with Ping Federate, with Sun Access Manager, with some other software. And it works, but yeah.
Extending on that question,
yeah.
do you ever intend to attend one of the interop fests, such as the ones that Liberty Alliance is holding?
Might be. We don't know for sure yet, but it could be that we do so. Yeah. Yeah. Question?
So, yeah, over here.
Yeah.
Is the question about interoperability shifting up a level to, of course, Simple SAML and EduGain and Shibboleth and SAML commercial products can exchange SAML assertions, but isn't the real question starting to be, can you consume each other's metadata?
Well, I think that's similar to the SAML protocol. The metadata format is also pretty standardized, so I don't see much problem related to that. But what I see is that SAML2 is a really complex and broad standard when you have a lot of options of ways to do things. And what I see a problem is that when one federation selects one way of doing things and another federation do things another way, maybe things are not working together as it should because there's too many ways of doing things. That's where we also have some work about specifying a minimalistic SAML single sign-on web single sign-on profile, which is a way of selecting the bare minimum you have to implement to be operatable with other, an approach to all those people that are implementing a subset of all the different options of doing stuff. If they just select the same subset, things will work much smoother.
Well, you actually answered my question. I was going to ask Ken if he was actually talking about profiling rather than metadata. Were you, Ken?
No, I was talking about metadata and acquisition dynamically, etc.
Right.
You're absolutely right about the profile. So,
right.
And that's the place where we're going.
Right. And so you were talking about dynamic. You were talking about dynamic trust rather than dynamic metadata, then, Rod, so to speak. Me neither, but yeah.
Yeah. Related to dynamic metadata resolution, I think I mentioned some of it earlier, but this OpenIDP stuff and the thing that we implemented where a default configuration of a service provider sets the entity to be the URL of its own metadata. That's something that we have been experimenting with and will experiment more with. And it's not only about distributing trust, but as Leif and I have been talking a lot of, you can put trust outside of this and just distribute metadata with signed documents and then rely trust on the signing key. Yeah.
Don't go away. I have one question. In line with the previous presentation and down to earth, do you have another simple SAML project in your mind, something like simple SAML Java or simple SAML ASP? Something for Microsoft platform for those who are unfortunate not running PHP, something?
Yeah, interesting question, because as I said, simple SAML PHP is written in PHP, and for integrating service applications, simple SAML PHP is simplest when it's done with PHP services. That said, we have done some work on using something called auth-mem cookie, which is a way that you do which you can use an Apache module to connect an application written in any programming language using the Apache module approach that they're using in Shibboleth with simple SAML PHP. We don't have any current plans on implementing simple SAML PHP from scratch in other programming languages, but maybe someone else is doing it, or maybe we will be doing it sometime in the future. Yeah.
It's interesting to know.
David Simonsen from Wave Denmark. I'm not personally doing it, but the Danish government is implementing both a Java and a .NET implementation. That will be open sourced, and this will be within, I think, about 6 months. It will be done.
Just a comment, because there is some pieces of something that could be a simple SAML Java that we have in Redis. Well, the only problem is that we are lacking the person to do the actual work right now. It was done a long time ago in terms of what we call the R. Apart from that, something I'm curious is about if you are planning or you have some ideas of moving to the wildest part of all this about web services, SOAP and all the like.
Regarding web services, as you saw on one of the slides, on the protocols list, I listed Open Authentication, or OAuth, which is a really simple way of doing delegation with web services. And that's something that we will look more into, play with, experiment with, and I think that the protocol, in a simple way, will solve most of the issues related to delegation of web services, but I see that there are also things that you cannot solve with this protocol. We will also look at IDWF, see is there a simple way to do this IDWF protocol. If so, maybe we'll do it. If not, then maybe one option is using something else. I think that web services and SOAP and these kind of things is something that we will look more into the future. So we don't have the answer yet. We are just beginning to look at it.
Do you have time for? It's not sort of a semi-question. It's more an assertion that there are a lot of people who are saying, I guess, to both of these projects, both to Shib and Simon, give me X, give me like what you did, but in .NET or something else. I want whatever you did, but I want it different. And I think that those people should think about actually doing another SAML implementation, because more in this case is better. And every time you're talking about protocol implementations, more is good. And having multiple independent implementations of something as important as SAML is a very good thing, right? So instead of asking Andreas for a simple SAML.NET, you should go home and do that yourself. From the perspective of your knowledge of .NET, you will find a way of doing that that's perfectly suited to that platform, right? If you're a Perl implementer, then you should do it in Perl from the point of view of a good Perl programming, a good Perl application framework or whatever. So more is better, and add your own stuff to this, to SAML. That will make, the identity meta system or whatever, if it's a messy system, it will make it better if we have more implementations.
Okay, so I think this perfectly closes our session. As we see, SAML is alive, and we have plenty of work still to do ahead of us. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, all the speakers, and Andreas. And yes, of course, lunch is served, so